Todd Dunn here on March 24th, 2018. This video is my first progress report on how well my treatment of my CLL with the regimen Chlorambucil plus Obinutuzumab is going. I started treatment on March 22nd with a 100 milligram infusion of Obinutuzumab and my first dose of Chlorambucil. And on March 23rd, I had my second infusion of 900 milligrams of Obinutuzumab. So let's have a look at how I went about assessing my progress, because my next blood test is not scheduled until April 5th, and I really wanted to know where I was standing before that. So let's take a look at the methodology I used to determine if I was responding to the treatment. Before the treatment, I took a sample of my blood and made a blood smear, and I did that immediately after the treatment was finished as well. Then I took the two blood smears before and after the treatment, and I took pictures of them with my microscope at 400 magnification. That's enough magnification for me to count and identify the white cells in the pictures. Because the number of cells in an individual picture may not be completely representative of the distribution of cells in the blood smear, I took between 10 and 40 pictures of each blood smear, where the number of pictures was determined by how many white cells I found in each picture. I then, after counting and identifying the white cells, I calculated a differential, where you take the total number of white cells you counted, and then you take the total number of lymphocytes that you counted, divide it by that total number of white cells, and so on for the different types of white cells. Then I used the differential and the average number of white cells per picture in combination with the most recent lab blood test that I had to calculate the absolute white count, the absolute lymphocyte count, and the absolute neutrophil count for each of my blood smears. These are representative photomicrographs of my before and after treatment blood smears. The before treatment smear was taken 12 hours before I started treatment, and the after treatment smear was done 5.5 hours after I completed my second day of treatment. The left-hand side is the before picture, the right-hand side is the after picture. What's worth noting is the number of white cells. They're the cells that have sort of blue color. And in the left picture, the before picture, there are 41 lymphocytes, there's 1 neutrophil, and 1 monocyte. On the after picture, there are only 6 lymphocytes, and there were no neutrophils or monocytes in this field of view. For the before blood smear, because of the higher number of white cells, I counted 10 pictures. And for the after blood smear, where there weren't quite as many white cells, I counted 20 pictures. And I used those results to calculate a differential for each of the two smears, and also to determine the average number of white cells in a typical field of view. Now let's take a look at the actual data I used to determine my response to the first cycle of treatment with Chlorambucil and Obinutuzumab. As soon as I got to the clinic on the 22nd, the nurse took a blood sample and sent it down to the lab for testing. She got the CBC result back very quickly, only about 10 minutes, and the lab had determined that I had an absolute white count of 145.2, an absolute lymphocyte count of 140.8, and a lymphocyte percentage of 97. So here are the results for my two blood smears. The first blood smear was taken 12 hours before the lab test. So I assumed that since all I had done was sleep during that time, nothing had changed. So I arbitrarily set the absolute white count for that blood smear to 145.2. And after I counted white cells in 10 pictures of the blood smear, I determined that there were 41 white cells per photograph. I identified the white cells and determined the lymphocyte percentage. I multiplied that by my assumed absolute white count and got a lymphocyte count of 140.7, which, as you can see, is essentially identical to the result that the lab got. And just below that is the result for the second smear that I took 5.5 hours after completing my second infusion. That smear had 7.47 white cells per field of view that I counted. And that's based on 19 photographs. When I calculated the differential, I got 86.8% lymphocytes. I calculated the absolute white count by taking the 7.47 cells per field of view from this smear, dividing it by the 41 cells per field of view in the earlier smear, and multiplying by the assumed absolute white count of 145.2, which gave me an absolute white count after treatment of 26.5. Now let's look at those results in a little bit more coherent way. Just before treatment, I had a lab test that gave a white count of 145.2, a lymphocyte count of 140.8, and a neutrophil count of 1.5. If I look at my blood smear from 12 hours earlier and arbitrarily set the white count to 145.2 and then use the differential I determined, I get a lymphocyte count of 140.7, which is essentially the same, and a neutrophil count of 1.4, which is also essentially the same. Then looking at the smear from 4 hours after treatment, I get a white count of 26.5, a lymphocyte count of 22.9, and a neutrophil count of 1.9. This says that my absolute lymphocyte count decreased by 83.7% as a result of treatment. So I would say that it looks like I'm definitely responding, and responding very well to treatment. I'm already at a partial response. My next treatment is in just under a week on March 29th, and I will do a blood smear before treatment and a blood smear after treatment. I am not scheduled to get a blood test that day, but I think I can talk them into doing it anyway, which will give me another reference point, and I can do the same calculation again and determine how effective my second treatment was. So I intend to do this pretty much after every treatment, just to see how things are going so that I have a good assessment of my progress in this treatment. But based on the result after the first treatment, it's looking pretty good. Okay, thanks for watching. If you liked it, give me a thumbs up, and I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. That way you'll get notifications of my future videos. Thanks again for watching.